Okay, so prepping for a climatologist interview, huh?
That's awesome. It's such a vital field, especially these days. We're going to dive into these RoleCatcher resources they've got and hopefully help you totally crush it.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how these interviews have actually changed.
Yeah.
They're not just looking for a textbook definition of like climate change.
Yeah.
It's more about, can you like critically think about this stuff? Can you problem solve? And can you communicate these really complex concepts in a way that really clicks?
So it's like explaining to me what's going on outside my window versus like the larger forces that are shaping our world and our future.
Exactly. And that's actually a really good point because that's kind of what this first question from the Role Catcher Guide is getting at. It says, can you explain the difference between weather and climate? It seems kind of basic, but nailing that right off the bat is so key.
Get that foundational understanding right away.
Yeah.
So how would you recommend someone tackles that?
I always suggest connecting it to something personal.
So you could say something like, weather is what I'm wearing today. Climate is like my wardrobe over seasons and years.
I like that.
So it shows you get that weather is sort of the short-term atmospheric conditions, what's happening right now, what's happening today, and climate is those long-term patterns and trends.
I love that analogy. Super clear, concise, and it really gets the point across. Now, the guide also mentions being ready to discuss the causes of climate change. That feels a lot meatier. What are the primary causes of climate change and how do they impact the planet?
Definitely. And they're not just looking for you to like rattle off a list of things. They want to see that you really understand the difference between what's human influenced and what's natural. So think about like volcanic eruptions versus deforestation,
Yeah.
solar cycles versus industrial emissions, and then be ready to talk about not just the cause, but its specific impact.
It's like connecting those dots,
Yeah.
right? So increased carbon emissions lead to things like sea level rise, extreme weather events.
The X-ray.
And this is where I think RoleCatcher AI can really come in handy. Yeah. And be a game changer.
Yeah.
Because you can get that feedback and make sure you're using the right terminology, but explaining it in a way that really resonates for maybe the specific role that you're going for.
Totally.
It's like having a little editor in your pocket as you prep.
Yeah.
So speaking of staying ahead of the curve, the next question is all about keeping up with the latest in the field. How do you stay up to date with the latest research and developments in climatology? So what are some things our listeners should be thinking about when they answer this?
This is where you get to really let that passion shine through and
Yeah.
show that you're proactive. So you don't want to just mention the big reports like the IPCC reports, dig a little deeper. Are you following any groundbreaking studies maybe on like glacial melt rates in Antarctica or the impact of changing ocean currents?
It's like showing you're not just keeping up.
Hmm.
You are really engaged. You're on the cutting edge of what's happening in the field.
Yeah.
Now, the guide does specifically call out conferences, journals, professional organizations.
And for good reason,
Yeah.
because that shows commitment, being a part of those communities. And if you can mention specific journals you follow, maybe it's the Journal of Climate, Nature, Climate Change, and then you can call out an article or a study that you found interesting, I think that can really help you stand out.
It's like saying, I'm not just reading about this.
Yeah.
I'm part of the conversation.
Yes,
Versus just giving some generic answer.
for sure.
Okay, so speaking of specifics, let's get into the weeds a little bit here. The next question is all about data and the tools of the trade. How do you collect and analyze climate data? And what tools do you use? So be prepared to go beyond the basics here.
Definitely.
We're not just talking about thermometers and rain gauges anymore.
Right. You've got to think about things like remote sensing, using satellites to track deforestation or sea ice extent, or maybe analyzing ice cores to understand past climates. And all of these methods, they give us vastly different sets of data.
And I think it's important to highlight the limitations of each approach, right? So we have a weather station that can tell us about a specific location, but it doesn't give us the global picture that satellite data does.
Exactly. Showing that you understand not only the tools, but also what they can't do, I think is really important.
Okay, so while our listeners are brushing up on their data analysis skills, I want to touch on another key concept, atmospheric gases. It's no surprise that this question pops up in the guide. Can you explain the role of atmospheric gases in climate change?
Right. And this is your chance to really flex those scientific muscles. Don't just list the greenhouse gases, go a little deeper. Explain their specific properties and how they actually affect the climate.
So it's like saying carbon dioxide is like a warming blanket versus explaining how that blanket traps heat in the atmosphere.
Exactly. And think about how different gases absorb and re-emit infrared radiation. You've got gases like methane, which is a far more potent heat-trapping gas than carbon dioxide, even though it has a shorter lifespan in the atmosphere.
Oh, interesting.
So it's those nuances that I think really demonstrate you have that deeper understanding.
And I have a feeling that's something RoleCatcher's AI would pick up on and help users refine in their answers as well.
Definitely. Because it's really looking for those areas where you can provide a bit more depth and clarity and make sure that your answer is going to stand out.
It's like having a tutor right in your pocket who understands the complexities of this and can guide you to a better answer.
Yes.
Now, speaking of impact, the next question focuses on something that is so crucial for anyone in this field, and that's communication. How do you communicate climate science to non-experts, such as policymakers or the general public?
It's so important because it's not enough to just understand the science yourself. You've got to be able to communicate those implications to a broader audience.
Yeah, you might be talking to policymakers who are making decisions, community members who are concerned about the local impacts. So how do you tailor your communication style for those different groups?
And that's where I think storytelling can be really powerful. So for example, instead of overwhelming a community group with all of this data on sea level rise, you could share a story about a coastal community that's already experiencing those effects.
And make it feel real, make it relatable. You're not just showing data, you're connecting on an emotional level.
Exactly. And when you're communicating with policymakers, it's about connecting the science to the policy solutions.
Oh, interesting.
So instead of just saying we need to reduce emissions, you can talk about the economic benefits of investing in renewable energy or the public health improvements that come with cleaner air.
So it's like you're speaking their language,
Yes.
but instead of words, you're using data and you're using insights
Exactly.
to get your message across.
Yes.
Okay, so you ready to tackle another question from the RoleCatcher guide?
Hit me.
All right, this one's a bit of a curveball. Can you describe a time you had to deal with conflicting climate data and how you resolved it?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Right, so it's not just testing what you know. It's assessing your problem-solving skills, your
Yep.
critical thinking.
Exactly. And it's a behavioral interview question, so they're looking for a specific example.
So let's say I'm the interviewee, and I'm thinking back on a project, and I did encounter conflicting data sets. Where do I even begin to structure an answer like that?
The STAR method is going to be your best friend here.
Ah, the good old STAR method. Take us back to school. Can you remind us what that is?
Yeah, so STAR stands for Situation, Task, Action, Result. It's just a way to structure your answer to make it super clear and concise and easy for the interviewer to follow along.
Okay, so walk me through it. How would we apply those four things to this specific question about the conflicting data?
Okay, so you would start by describing the situation. So maybe you were analyzing temperature trends for a specific region, and you found some discrepancies between two data sets.
Okay, so you're setting the scene, you're clearly explaining what the problem is.
Yes.
What's next?
Then you got to talk about the task. What were you actually trying to do with this data?
Yeah.
Were you building a climate model? Were you putting together a report for stakeholders? What was your objective?
So you're clarifying the objective in that situation.
Yes.
Okay, then comes the action, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is where you get into the specifics of how you actually address this conflicting data. So did you go and consult with some experts? Did you have to conduct further research? Did you have to go back and re-examine your methodology?
So really highlighting that problem-solving process and showing your work a little bit.
Yes.
Okay, and then to wrap it all up, we've got the result.
The results. So what actually happened? Were you able to reconcile the data? Did you have to adjust your approach? What did you learn from that experience?
The STAR method, I feel like, is helpful for so many interview questions because it's just a really good way to make sure you are hitting the highlights and keeping things focused.
For sure. And it shows that you can approach these challenges thoughtfully and that you can think critically.
Right. It's not always about having the right answer. It's about how you get there.
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of complex, the next question dives into something that I think is really crucial to understand, and that's uncertainty. How do you incorporate uncertainty and variability into your climate models and predictions?
Right. And it's something that can be really hard to communicate effectively,
It is.
both to other scientists and then to the public at large.
It's like, on the one hand, you want to be like, we're confident in these projections, but then also acknowledge that there is some uncertainty in any model.
For sure.
So how do you even begin to address that in an interview setting?
I think first and foremost, Just acknowledge that uncertainty exists and where it comes from.
Okay.
So you could talk about the natural variability in the climate system.
Okay.
So things like El Nino and La Nina cycles, these can really influence our short-term climate patterns.
So it's like acknowledging that it's a complex system.
Yes.
And we don't have all the answers,
Sure.
every single variable.
You don't. And then you can also talk about the limitations of the models themselves. No model is perfect. There are always going to be some uncertainties because of the data that we input and the assumptions that we're making.
Right. So being honest about that without undermining what the models can do.
Right. And then you can talk about the specific methods that you use to try and account for that uncertainty. So maybe you use ensemble modeling or probabilistic forecasting.
Can you explain those a little bit more? I feel like those might be new terms for some folks.
Yeah, so ensemble modeling basically means you're running multiple simulations of a climate model, and each one has slightly different starting conditions or parameters.
So instead of just relying on one single projection,
Yes.
you're looking at a range of what's possible.
Exactly. It's like when you check the weather and you look at a couple of different forecasts.
Yes.
Just to get a sense of what the range of temperatures might be.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And what about probabilistic forecasting?
So probabilistic forecasting takes that a step further and actually assigns probabilities to the different outcomes. So instead of saying the temperature is going to rise by 2 degrees, you might say there's like a 60% chance that temperatures will rise between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees.
So it's about acknowledging that range of possibilities, but also communicating it in a way that's easier to understand.
Exactly.
Yeah, good.
And it's a really valuable skill because it allows for more informed decision-making in the face of uncertainty.
Which is what we're always dealing with.
Always.
It's like, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's how we're accounting for that
Yes.
in our projections. And that is something I'm sure that RoleCatcher AI could also help people refine and how they explain that to others.
Definitely, because these are hard concepts to wrap your head around, let alone explain to someone else. So getting that feedback can be really, really helpful.
It's like having that coach right there with you, guiding you to the best way to communicate your expertise.
For sure.
But let's move on to, I think, a question that gets to the heart of climate action. Can you explain the difference between climate adaptation and climate mitigation?
Yes, this is a big one.
It's such an important distinction to make.
It is.
Because it's really about understanding the two different approaches that we need to be taking to deal with climate change.
Right. So climate mitigation is all about reducing those greenhouse gas emissions to prevent further warming.
So things like switching to renewable energy sources, improving energy efficiency, protecting forests, all of that falls under mitigation.
Exactly. All those efforts that are aimed at slowing down or even reversing climate change, that's mitigation. Adaptation, on the other hand, is about adjusting to the changes that are already happening and preparing for those future impacts.
So that would be like building seawalls to protect from rising sea levels, developing drought-resistant crops,
Yes.
creating early warning systems for extreme weather.
Exactly. Climate adaptation is all about becoming more resilient.
And it's important to say we need both.
We need both.
It's not an either.
It's not either.
We've got to do both, reduce our emissions and adapt to what's already happening. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet while also cleaning up the water that's already spilled on the floor.
That's a great analogy.
You got to deal with the source of the problem and what's happening because of it.
I like that.
Okay. And that really, I think, underscores the need for these experts,
Definitely.
for climatologists who get it,
Yeah,
who can really help us find solutions.
absolutely.
So speaking of solutions, I want to touch on another question that gets at the wider impacts of climate change.
Yeah.
How do you assess the economic and social impacts of climate change, and what tools do you use? And I think this is so important
It is.
as we're seeing these effects becoming more and more pronounced in the world around us.
Yeah, it's a big one. And it highlights just how interconnected climate change is with all these other challenges that we're facing. It's not just an environmental issue. It has far-reaching economic and social consequences.
Yeah, it impacts everything from our food security to human health to global migration patterns. It's huge.
It is.
So how do you even begin to approach a question like that in an interview? What kind of tools would you even mention?
You could talk about how you use economic models
Okay.
to try to estimate the costs of climate change impacts. Maybe it's damage to infrastructure,
Yeah.
loss of agricultural productivity, increased healthcare spending.
It's putting like a price tag
Yeah,
on what happens if we don't take action,
exactly.
which I think could be a really powerful way to motivate people.
It is. And then you could also talk about how you use maybe social surveys and demographic data
Okay.
to understand how climate change is impacting different communities.
So thinking about things like how heat waves are disproportionately
Yeah.
affecting
Yes.
lower income communities, or how sea level rise is displacing people along the coasts.
Exactly. It's making sure that when we're thinking about solutions, they're just and equitable.
This question, I feel like, really gets at the complexity of climate change
It does.
and how many different factors are at play. It's not just one thing.
No, it's not. It's a system.
It's a whole system, and we need climatologists to be thinking about that. Okay, one last question from the RoleCatcher guide before we move on. And this one's a little bit more philosophical.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on the role of science in shaping public policy?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Right.
And it's something that I think every scientist, especially those working in fields that have such huge policy implications like climate change, they grapple with this.
It's bridging that gap, right?
It is.
Between like the research,
Yeah.
the scientific community,
Yeah.
and then like the policymakers.
Yeah, ideally, science will play a central role in informing those policy decisions.
Yeah.
Because if we're not using the best available evidence, then we're
Yeah.
kind of just operating in the dark.
Totally flying blind.
Right. But the reality is it's not always that simple. There are political factors, economic factors, social factors that all come into play as well.
It's not just about presenting the data and expecting everyone to be like, okay, let's do this.
Right. And that's why I think scientists really need to be able to communicate their findings in a way that resonates with people and with policymakers.
So it's not just about being an expert in your field. It's about being a really good communicator.
Exactly.
And sometimes stepping outside of your comfort zone,
Yeah,
maybe doing some advocacy or public outreach
you have to.
to make sure that the science has a seat at the table
For sure.
when these decisions are being made.
Are said. Okay, so we've covered a ton in this deep dive so far. We've unpacked some key questions that you might encounter in an interview.
And we've talked about how important it is to really go beyond just those surface level answers to really show your understanding.
Totally. It's about showcasing your skills, those critical thinking skills,
Yeah.
your ability to communicate complex topics,
No,
and your passion for tackling this global challenge.
for sure.
And while we've really focused on these specific questions, the skills that we talked about are going to be applicable no matter what.
Totally.
Whether you're just starting out in climatology or you're a seasoned professional.
Those critical thinking skills, that clear communication, and showing how passionate you are about this field, that's huge.
Definitely.
And don't forget, RoleCatcher can be a really valuable tool in your job search. So from tailoring your CV to practicing those answers and getting feedback, it's really an invaluable resource.
It really is.
All right, let's take a quick pause here. And when we come back, we're going to delve into some more specific career insights from the RoleCatcher Career Guide and talk about how that AI can help you put your best foot forward in your job search. Stay tuned.
And we're back. So before the break, we were talking about some of those common climatologist interview questions. And I always love a good career roadmap, so I want to dig into some of those insights from the RoleCatcher Guide, the beyond the interview stuff.
Yeah, it's a great resource for anyone who is looking to kind of map out their trajectory in this field. And one thing I found really interesting was they actually break down the different stages from entry level all the way to, more senior positions.
So it's like, okay, you aced the interview, you got the job.
What's next? What's next?
Exactly. So for someone just starting out, they really emphasize how important hands-on experience is.
Right.
So internships, research assistant positions, those are really key for building a strong foundation.
It's like get your foot in the door advice, but for climatology, it's like get your boots muddy.
Get your boots muddy, exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's those real-world experiences, the field work, the data collection, that's really going to make a difference, not just for checking things off a list,
Right.
but for developing those practical skills
Yeah.
and figuring out, where you fit in.
And I'm sure those experiences give you great stories for future interviews.
The best stories.
Tell me about a time you faced a challenge in the field. Well, I was battling mosquitoes, trying to collect ice cores
Exactly.
in Greenland. So, speaking of standing out, the guide also talks about networking,
Yes.
attending conferences, joining professional organizations, even just connecting with people online
Definitely.
whose work you admire. Those relationships can be so valuable.
They open doors, that's for sure. Because it's not always what you know, it's who you know.
It's who you know. And, speaking of connections, this is something that RoleCatcher actually helps with as well, right?
100%. I mean, it's an amazing tool for this because it can connect you with potential mentors, suggest, conferences and events that are happening based on your interests,
Wow.
even help you discover, job openings
Oh, wow.
at places that are doing work that you're really excited about.
So it's like a personalized career fair.
It is.
Right there in your pocket.
It takes out a lot of the guesswork, especially for people who are new to the field and maybe, find that whole networking thing kind of intimidating.
Which is totally understandable. No matter what field you're in, that can be really scary.
Absolutely.
But in a field like this,
it's so important.
It's so collaborative. It's so important.
You got to do it.
So let's say our listener has been working in the field for a while. They've got some experience. They're building their network. What does that upward trajectory look like in this field?
Yeah, so they actually give a couple of different routes you can take. Some people might move into, leadership positions within research institutions or government agencies. So leading teams, shaping those research agendas.
So moving from analyzing the data to actually shaping the policy decisions and kind of the direction of the research.
Exactly. Others might transition into a related field. So maybe something like environmental consulting or policy analysis.
Interesting.
So they're taking that climate expertise and they're bringing it to these broader issues.
Right, because you have that foundation of the science.
Exactly.
And you can apply it in all these different ways.
100%. And then, of course, some people go the academic route. They're leading their own research projects, they're mentoring students, they're publishing their findings.
So there's a lot of options.
There are.
Each with their own, challenges and rewards, I'm sure.
For sure.
But that's got to be exciting to have those different paths you can take.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And regardless of which path you choose, they emphasize how important continuous learning is.
Oh, absolutely.
Because this is a field where, new discoveries and advancements
Always changing.
are happening all the time, so you got to keep up.
You can't just rest on what you learned back in,
You can't just get that PhD,
grad school.
call it a day.
Exactly. Got to stay curious.
Stay curious.
Which is something I love because it's the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know.
Yeah.
And this is a field where there's always more to know.
Absolutely. That's what makes it so exciting.
Okay, so speaking of exciting, I want to jump back into the RoleCatcher resources.
That's good.
And tackle another one of these interview questions.
Hit me.
If you're up for it.
I'm ready.
All right, so this one's a bit of a thought experiment. Imagine you're tasked with developing a climate change adaptation plan for a coastal city that's facing rising sea levels. What are some of the key factors that you would consider?
Ooh. Okay, so this is really getting at the practical application of this, putting on your problem-solving hat.
Totally. It's like you're the climate consultant now, and you're coming up with these solutions.
Right. And there's no one right answer.
Right.
But there are some key things you definitely want to think about.
Like what? Where do you even begin with something like that?
Well, first of all, you need to really understand the specific risks that this city is facing.
Okay.
So how much sea level rise are we talking?
Yeah.
What's the timeline? And what kind of impact is that going to have on their infrastructure?
Right.
The ecosystems, the people. You've got to know what you're dealing with before you can make a plan.
Like a doctor diagnosing a patient.
Exactly.
Before they can figure out the treatment plan.
100%. So once you kind of have a handle on the risks, then you can start brainstorming those adaptation strategies.
Okay, so give us some examples. What are some of the things that you might do?
Yeah. One approach is to protect what's already there. So you're building seawalls, elevating buildings, relocating those really crucial facilities inland.
So you're trying to hold back the water, basically.
Yeah. But those hard engineering solutions, they can be really expensive.
They can be.
And they're not always the best long-term option.
So what's another approach you could take?
So you could focus on something called ecosystem-based adaptation, which is basically using natural systems to kind of help buffer against those impacts. So think restoring coastal wetlands or planting mangrove forests.
So working with nature.
Yes.
Rather than against it.
Exactly. And these nature-based solutions often come with a lot of other benefits.
Yeah.
Improved water quality, biodiversity, recreational opportunities.
Win-win.
Win-win. And then in addition to all of those physical adaptation measures, you've also got to consider those social and economic factors.
So what kinds of things fall under that umbrella?
Well, for one thing, you want to make sure that whatever solutions you're coming up with are equitable,
Okay.
that they're not putting an unfair burden on certain communities.
So thinking about those communities that are most vulnerable and
Exactly.
making sure that we're not making things worse for them.
Exactly. And then you also want to think about the local economy.
Okay.
You know, are there ways to strengthen that economy and even create new jobs
Right.
in the face of these challenges?
So it's not just protecting the physical structures, it's thinking about how do we create
It's
a
everything.
community that
Yeah.
can thrive
Yeah,
in this changing environment.
exactly. It's really about taking this holistic approach. You're thinking about the people, you're thinking about the environment, and you're thinking long term,
long term.
making sure that you're making decisions that are going to benefit people
Yeah.
for generations to come.
This question really, I think, highlights the importance of systems thinking
It does.
and collaborating with people
It takes a village.
from different fields and backgrounds because it's not something that one person can solve.
No, you need engineers,
Yeah.
you need ecologists, economists, social scientists. Everybody's got to get involved.
It takes a planet to solve climate change.
That's a good one. I like that.
And we're back. So we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive into the world of climatology.
Yeah.
From acing those interview questions to thinking about your career path. And you know me, I always like to end on an inspiring note. So for our listeners out there who are passionate about tackling this global crisis and they're thinking about a career in climatology, what advice would you give them?
I would say follow your curiosity. Never stop learning and don't be afraid to, shake things up a little bit.
Yeah.
We need people who are creative, who are ready to solve these problems, and who can communicate those ideas effectively.
It's not just about the science.
It's not just the science.
It's about connecting with people and advocating for change.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of collaboration. Find your people you know, share your ideas, support each other's work. This is a movement that thrives on collective action and different points of view.
Love that. Well said. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a pleasure having you.
It's been fun.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of climatology. We hope you learned something new. Maybe you're feeling inspired and empowered to take action. Remember, the future of our planet really does depend on all of us taking action. And that starts with understanding the science. So keep those brains engaged, keep that curiosity alive, and keep making a difference. Until next time.